Washington is spending billions of dollars to convince you that China is the enemy. But Gen Z has other plans. As memes about China maxing and turning Chinese go viral, the US propaganda machine seems to be losing its grip on the information war. Are these just social media trends, or are we witnessing a massive generational shift in US perceptions of China among youth? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. Businessman and media mogul Jimmy Lai has been sentenced to 20 years in prison for national security crimes. The 78-year-old was convicted by Hong Kong's High Court on Monday for colluding with foreign forces and using his now defunct Apple Daily newspaper and network of international contacts to push for sanctions against the local and central governments. Central to his trial and conviction were Lai's meetings with U.S. officials, including Representative Nancy Pelosi, former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, and former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Prosecutors allege that these meetings were to arrange foreign interference during the 2019 Hong Kong protests. 8 former associates and activists received sentences up to 10 years, while the court imposed hefty fines totaling over $1 million on the newspaper's operating companies. President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin held a high-stakes video call last Wednesday. The two leaders solidified a new blueprint for strategic cooperation, with Putin accepting an invitation to visit China twice this year. This deepening partnership comes as a direct counterweight to Western pressure, with both leaders framing their partnership as a stabilizing force. They emphasize growing trade, energy ties, and high-tech collaboration, including space research and reciprocal visa-free travel, positioning their alliance as a shield for their respective socioeconomic welfare and right to choose their own development paths. Beyond bilateral ties, the conversation focused heavily on navigating a world redefined by the return of Donald Trump. She also noted during the meeting that 2026 marks a dual milestone: the 30th anniversary of the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership and the 25th anniversary of their Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. To mark the occasion, she announced the official launch of the China-Russia Years of Education, a bilateral initiative for 2026 and 2027, where the two countries will increase exchanges in education and people-to-people cooperation. China has issued a forceful demand for the U.S. to halt its unjust targeting of Chinese citizens. In a press conference last week, Beijing's foreign ministry spokesman, Lin Jian, condemned a recent incident in which Chinese corporate personnel were reportedly detained for nearly 60 hours upon entering the U.S. and deported without cause. Lin stated, such harsh law enforcement moves infringed on the legitimate and lawful rights and interests of the Chinese nationals concerned, disrupted normal business cooperation between the two countries, and soured the atmosphere for people-to-people exchanges. More importantly, he continued, they violated the common understandings reached between the two presidents in Busan on strengthening economic and trade cooperation. China will continue to take resolute measures to firmly protect the legitimate and lawful rights and interests of Chinese nationals. The U.S. has launched an effort to counter China's dominance over the critical mineral supply chain. The State Department recently convened officials from over 50 nations, including EU countries, India, and Japan, to forge a trade zone for the critical minerals essential to everything from advanced weaponry to smartphones. Vice President J.D. Vance proposed creating a new critical mineral trading bloc and said that the U.S. will unveil a pricing floor system that Washington hopes will unlock private investment in mining and processing projects that have struggled to compete with cheaper Chinese supply. The Trump administration is pledging to deploy hundreds of billions of dollars in capital to jumpstart mining projects and secure domestic production. Scientists have successfully grown a butterfly in space, marking a quiet revolution for life support science. Researchers from China's Chongqing University recently confirmed that a butterfly successfully emerged from its chrysalis within a self-contained biological payload orbiting Earth. The chrysalis was brought aboard a Qiao 11 carrier rocket back in December, and the butterfly pupa was encased in a self-sustaining capsule heated to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. This 8.3 kilogram miniature ecosystem functioned as a closed loop environment where plants generated oxygen and microorganisms processed waste, allowing the insect to complete its metamorphosis in microgravity. This experiment represents far more than a biological novelty. It is a critical validation of complex life support systems required for deep space exploration. By overcoming technical hurdles like structural corrosion in high humidity environments, scientists have proven that stable, autonomous habitats can sustain higher life forms without human intervention. Building on previous successes with other animals like zebrafish and mice, this mission brings humanity one step closer to developing regenerative ecosystems capable of supporting long-term life far beyond Earth's atmosphere. Well, forget everything you've been told about the inevitable conflict with China. Defense contractors give millions of dollars a year to think tanks to manufacture a new Cold War, but Washington is losing the battle of ideas among the youth as memes of China maxing and turning Chinese go viral on TikTok and Instagram. Meanwhile, in China, the viral concept of the kill line exposes the fragility of the so-called American dream. Are these just social media trends, or is it the sign of something deeper? A massive generational shift in the perception of both China and the U.S. that's leaving the billion-dollar propaganda machines in the dust. To discuss this, we are so pleased to welcome Emma and Charles Xu. They're both members of Qiao Collective, a diaspora Chinese media collective challenging U.S. aggression on China. Emma and Charles, welcome to the China Report.
Thanks so much for having us on, Amanda. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, well, we're really happy to have you. Before we begin the discussion, I just want to show a few clips, a few viral TikToks to kind of illustrate this meme that we're talking about of like turning Chinese and you've met me at a very Chinese time in my life.
Nah, yo, I gotta be careful in here, man. I'm damn close to getting some shit like this and just start Chinese maxing, I swear.
You do have some kind of plan for the final rounds, don't you?
Yeah, so I'm sure that both of you have seen these viral videos on Instagram and TikTok. You know, is this meme going around where Americans are doing fairly mundane things like drinking hot water in the morning, making white rice, eating noodle soups, things that are like so-called Chinese coded, and saying that they're like turning Chinese. And this is a really stark shift from just a few years ago where we were kind of trying to push back this rampant anti-Chinese racism. So both of you are in Qiao Collective, which was so instrumental in pushing back on that kind of propaganda. So from your point of view, how did we in just the span of a few years get from that kind of rampant xenophobia to being Chinese actually being cool? Emma, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the whiplash in the last 5 years from how China is being portrayed has been kind of crazy to see. You know, we sort of went from seeing everything Chinese portrayed as like stolen or a knockoff of the West and kind of like inherently inferior and uncool, right? And kind of as like the butt of the joke, like spreading disease, dirty, all these things that were contributing to like Asian hate crimes in the U.S. And I think just a lot of portrayals of Chinese people as victims of an oppressive government who aren't able to think for themselves or enjoy any kind of living standards similar to like what we think we have in the West. And so now I think a couple of things have really contributed to like this total 180. First, I want to say it's the TikTok ban and migration to Xiaohongshu or Red Note, I think last January. And also, I think we're able to see for the first time, like Americans getting to visit China with the visa-free policy and like share their experiences there. And yeah, a lot of the travel bloggers and streamers like I Show Speed visiting have had a huge cultural impact. And I think another huge thing has been seeing how our respective governments are responding to public health crises like COVID in 2020 And with the ongoing genocide in Gaza, I think Americans are feeling a lot of disillusionment with our government, especially as we're seeing the difference in living conditions of everyday people in the U.S. versus in China. Like we're seeing, like higher life expectancy, home ownership rates, like access to healthcare and more educational opportunities. And I think it's really shaking up like Americans' cultural national identity. They're realizing that being American doesn't like feel cool anymore, and that they want better. And I think that's why so many Americans are starting to aspire to be Chinese. We're seeing all the cool things and products and things that people are able to experience in China that we're not able to have here. And I think Americans are starting to question, like, why can't we have that? What will it take for us to be able to have these things? And I think Americans are kind of like adopting Chinese like health and exercise and cooking practices because we're seeing just the differences in like the health and happiness of Chinese people versus what we're having here. And now being Chinese is cool and being American isn't.
Well, I think it really speaks to something that defense contractors and U.S. megacorporations funnel so much money into these think tanks like ASPI, like the Atlantic Council, to manufacture these anti-China narratives and to really shape the public discourse around China. And to advocate for anti-China policy. And they have these endless budgets to shape the rhetoric, the public conversation. But in the end, it's looking to be fairly ineffective among the youth, especially in this era of social media and TikTok. They're really losing the information war among Gen Z. So Charles, I was wondering if you could speak to these trends and, what do these trends really say about the new Cold War and the current geopolitical situation? And what do they say about, U.S. propaganda around China in general?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Amanda, this is a very sophisticated propaganda operation. And so I think we need to break it down into a couple of different prongs, right? The main one, and the one that, has the most purchase with older generations who, lived, for example, through the original Cold War, would be China as a threat to quote unquote national security. The thing is that in order to have any purchase, that narrative requires sort of a base level of patriotism, actual positive affective identification with the US, and also conformity with US and Western norms. And among younger people, this was frankly not high to begin with. Even, during the height of the sort of xenophobic wave several years ago. And it's absolutely cratered, obviously, since the beginning of the US and Zionist genocide in Gaza. So if anything, that particular narrative, the one centered on patriotism, on national defense, and so on, I think has helped generate sort of a contrarian counter-identification. And this, of course, as Emma mentioned, is best exemplified by the threatened ban and then the actual forced sale of TikTok, which involved a perfect confluence of, what was often portrayed as a kind of boomer hysteria, right, about both China and anti-Zionism among the youth. And that, of course, led to, the Xiaohongshu migration as a, semi-ironic and almost overt embrace, right, of the narrative of Chinese spying, right, like younger people willingly giving their data to China. So, of course, that was counterproductive for the ruling class. And that's why there's been a sort of subtler parallel propaganda narrative, which is, I would say, targeted more particularly at young people and which tries to exploit, the youthful sense of rebelliousness and contrarianism by painting China as, sort of culturally conformist, stultifying, authoritarian, repressive, and somehow both fundamentally alien, while also still reproducing the ugliest features of Western society. For example, racism, genocide, settler colonialism, and so on, right? effectively, what this is doing is it's trying to render China cringe and uncool for the same reasons the U.S. is manifestly cringe and uncool. And examples of these narratives that used to have maybe a little bit of purchase, I think, would include sort of the left washing of Hong Kong separatism and the pink washing of Taiwan separatism, which of course ignores those two movements' nostalgic embrace of British and Japanese colonialism, respectively. So the thing is that more recently, that narrative too has run aground, right? And as Emma mentioned, this was not because of any sort of intentional soft power counteroffensive by the Chinese state, because, let's be frank, their official English language media apparatus is it punches below its weight, right? To say the least. But really, it was the sheer volume of direct and unmediated and organic exposure to the richness and dynamism of everyday Chinese life that people have been getting directly through social media. I want to name as well a couple dynamics specifically that have taken root in Trump's second term. So just the past year or two, or just the past year, right? At a surface level, of course, with Trump, you have at the highest levels of U.S. government, like an open and almost performative, display of what was once a veiled sort of sadism and fascistic cruelty, right? Which, of course, makes China more appealing purely by relative comparison. But also, interestingly, this time around, Trump seems to have forsworn U.S. soft power entirely, right? He's more or less abandoned the democracy versus autocracy framing. He's gutted the National Endowment for Democracy, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia. He's kind of left all of these puppet NGOs in Taiwan and Hong Kong and the wider region, that have been ginning up these narratives totally adrift. And this pivot to hard power has also led, for now, to a sort of more realist assessment of China's actual capacity for self-defense, especially in the region, and therefore to a degree of hemispheric retrenchment, as we see with the so-called Donro Doctrine. So, while it's true that there has been no meaningful U.S. military drawdown from what it calls the Indo-Pacific region, in terms of the propaganda war, I would say the volume of overt state anti-China propaganda has lately been dwarfed by, the anti-Venezuela and anti-Cuba narratives, for example.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that, just a few decades before, with the reform and opening up period, when the US was a rising superpower, a lot of Chinese people looked to the West as a form of aspiration in terms of like a political system, in terms of culture. There was also a lot of migration from China to the US because they saw the education system here as better. They saw like attaining a university degree here as a way to move up the ladder. And they saw it as a way to make a better life for yourself. Now with the rise of China, almost the exact reverse is happening, right? China is in many ways surpassing the US, like as Emma mentioned a few minutes ago, surpassing the US in terms of life expectancy, of scientific and medical innovations, in terms of high-speed rail. Their cities are like even more developed than ours. And more Americans are also like visiting China because of their visa-free travel policy now. And so they're able to see what life in China is like for themselves, just like free of propaganda. And so I think that's what's like kind of translating into these social media trends. I've seen a lot of Western media frame this in the usual nefarious terms, like this is like a real soft power coup on the part of Beijing. But I also think people just see what's possible when they like actually see a government that fulfills your basic needs and has an interest in the well-being of its people.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation about the turnaround in sort of the relative, image of China and the U.S. to each other's populations since, for example, like the early 80s, the early reform period. I have to say that, even today, like anecdotally, at least from speaking, for example, with my relatives in China, it is precisely that generation that came of age in the early reform period. So roughly our parents' generation, who are still the hardest to convince about how shitty life actually is in the U.S. now. I remember when I was visiting 2 years ago, like they could not believe that like the handling of COVID here in the U.S. was even worse than Chinese state TV had led them to believe, right? And that maybe has shifted somewhat, but it is the case that particular generation has was inculcated into this ingrained sense of cultural, social, and especially like technological inferiority vis-a-vis an idealized image of the U.S., which resulted, yes, from like a realization of China's sort of objective material backwardness at the time, but also from an ideological retreat from the Mao period and the Cultural Revolution in particular. And so I think in some ways that was like a domestic mirror image of the fact that, China, this is not the first time China has had like soft power of a sort, right, in Western youth consciousness. But it was at a relative low point, I would say, in the 80s, even compared to what came before, because when I say soft power here, I don't mean it just in the sort of like depoliticized and aestheticized sense that you think of when you think of like K-pop or anime, right? These kind of like intentional mass export cultural products from, U.S. allies and vassals in the region. But I'm also thinking about how during the Cultural Revolution, the imagery, the rhetoric, the ubiquity of Mao's Little Red Book, they kind of perfectly captured the zeitgeist also of Western youth rebellion in the 60s. And, this idea emanating from China in particular and the third world in general, right, that, through voluntarist mass mobilization and political will, you could overcome, the obvious colonially inherited material backwardness of places like China, Korea, and Vietnam and smash imperialism, right? And liberate your country there. It had tremendous appeal for a Western youth movement that felt alienated, right, from society in the imperial core, but it was waging very much a quixotic uphill struggle to overthrow a system, in the U.S. and elsewhere that was basically stabilized by imperial rents. It was stabilized by class collaboration between, capitalists and the labor aristocracy, and also by a Keynesian social compact, which, more or less, like led people to believe that a rising tide genuinely lifted all boats, right? And of course, we all know what happened after that, which is that neoliberalism tore up that social compact. It neutralized the resistance movements. And, of course, at the same time, China seemed to pivot from overt confrontation with imperialism. So if we then fast forward to today, right, we have young people in the West who are in a deeply unequal and precarious and violent society. It's mired in material stagnation, if not outright regression. And they look to China today as a paragon of both technological progress and dynamism, right? But also what they see as an enviable degree of social and political stability. So I think that too actually can slide into a kind of ahistorical escapism, when you take the positive aspects of modern Chinese society out of context and you take them as a snapshot of a sort of timeless essence, right, which is unmoored from this longer history of colonial subjugation and violent revolutionary struggle that was what made its current prosperity possible. Like it might superficially dovetail with China's official discourse today of, like civilizational exchange and continuity rather than rupture. But that narrative, it is grounded in a robust collective memory in China of the wrenching but necessary sacrifices that previous generations had to make. And it's a constant battle, as Xi Jinping puts it, against historical nihilism. So absent that kind of memory culture that you have in China, this China maxing phenomenon, I think, it can lead in principle to a deeper anti-imperialist consciousness. But it could also squander that potential in favor of kind of quiescence and pure escapism. And I think, there's the potential for that even in the phrase, like, you've met me at a very Chinese time or a very Chinese moment in my life, right? It speaks to the potential transience of that. So, I think it is a positive development overall, but it's one that we really have to like intervene in and seize on in order to educate people politically about, the longer arc of Chinese history and Chinese revolutionary history in particular.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, but yeah, I do think that the social media trend, it does come from a kind of, a little bit of like I don't want to say hopelessness, but a disappointment among youth in terms of just growing up in the society that they find themselves. There's like the cost of living crisis. They're unable to make rent. Um, Healthcare is outrageous. And I want to shift a little bit from talking about like viral trends in the States to viral trends in China. Because on Chinese social media for the past few months, there's been this concept called the kill line that's been going viral there. And it was introduced by a 22-year-old Chinese student who lived in Seattle. I believe he was like a biology student, and he was working part-time. He was working part-time as a forensic assistant, so collecting like unclaimed bodies. And it turned out that a lot of them were people who were unhoused, right? And so he kind of borrowed this term from the gaming community called the kill line. And in the gaming community, it's basically when your character's health is so low that one hit or one blow will just like end you. And he adopted it to name or describe this precarious condition that a lot of Americans find themselves in, this kind of economic precarity, where a single emergency, like a medical emergency, a car accident, loss of employment, could push someone into irreversible financial collapse. So this concept of the kill line has been going viral for the past few months in China, and it's had this massive cultural impact. Emma, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this kill line, and why do you think it sparked such an intense debate in China?
Yeah, I think like Chinese people learning about really how close Americans are to like complete financial ruin and homelessness has been kind of shocking. I've been following a lot of discourse on Xiangshu about it, and it's actually been kind of entertaining watching like Americans be shocked by Chinese people being shocked at how we have to live here. I think that I've seen a lot of Chinese netizens, expressing shock that they thought they were being fed propaganda about like the conditions in the U.S., but it's so much worse than they actually thought. Yeah, there's just been lots of discussion about how shocking it is that Americans have to work multiple jobs and are so far in debt and can't afford like crucial healthcare treatment. And yeah, I think the like increase of like dialogue between Americans and Chinese people on Xiangshu has really highlighted like just the stark difference in how our governments treat everyday people and the lack of like social safety net that there really is here in the U.S.
Mhm. Yeah, Charles, what are your thoughts on the kill line? Like, why do you think it's picked up so much currency in China?
Yeah, definitely all the reasons that Emma named. I think it's interesting as well that it originates in gaming culture because, of course, like inherently in the structure of video games, life, or rather lives plural, are relatively cheap, right? If you die in the game, you can respawn, and I think that speaks to a corresponding cheapness and maybe a fundamental like unreality or perhaps surreality of life under U.S. capitalism, right? The other thing that I thought of, right, is that the kill line specifically is referring to a degree of financial precarity where a single emergency expense will throw you, as you said, into this irreversible debt spiral. And what that speaks to is specifically the credit and debt fueled personal consumption patterns that we're socialized into and incentivized into in the US specifically. I think that is something that also is, quite alien to a lot of Chinese people's experience because of, the extremely high household savings rate there, right? which you can attribute to any number of both like objective material and sort of cultural factors. But it is a major difference, in mentality and in actual financial practice, and it's in some ways magnified nationally, actually, into like policies of the central government, like maintaining a massive current account surplus, or this record-breaking $1.2 trillion trade surplus from last year that made so much news, or for example, stockpiling a national grain reserve in order to defend food sovereignty. And that actually is like the main line of attack against China's sovereign economic policies coming from Western neoclassical economists, right? They keep saying that China is, suffering from underconsumption versus overproduction or overinvestment. They say that it needs to shift from investment to consumption, right? In order to fully liberalize, fully westernize its economy. And we need to see that for what it is, right? Which is that, it's another sort of angle of attack where, in effect, they want to make China itself vulnerable, right, to the vagaries of the world financial system fully, right? In a word, they want to put China itself on a global kill line, I think that too is a major underlying cause for why this has caused so much discourse in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the impact of the kill line in China can't be overstated, right? It's had such a cultural impact that Qishi, the official theoretical journal of the CPC, they published an essay using the concept of the kill line as a structural feature of the U.S. Political system. And this is a quote from their essay. They state, "The systemic disconnect between political responsiveness and genuine social needs is precisely the structural contradiction that continues to deepen and become difficult to heal in American society. The kill line phenomenon reveals a cold-blooded capital-first institutional logic. Under this logic, institutional arrangements systematically prioritize capital security and returns over the survival and dignity of workers." So very, similar to what you were saying, Charles. And the impact has been so great that now the U.S. government and U.S. corporate media have been caught on the back foot and they're forced to defend themselves. In the past few weeks, I've seen mainstream media like The Economist and New York Times publishing articles addressing, the kill line. Why is China so obsessed with the kill line? Why is China so obsessed over American poverty? And even at this year's World Economic Forum, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was even questioned about the kill line by a Chinese reporter. And I want to show this clip and then get both of your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Mr. Bessent, and I'm the journalist from China Media Group. I want to ask that the FED said 37% of U.S. adults can't cover a $400 emergency. What do you think of it? And some calls list the Q line or Alice line for U.S. people, and the Q line is mainly for. It's used to describe the fragility of American household of finance. Unexpected expense is enough to plunge the middle class into the financial ruin. So, what's your opinion of it?
Again, if we look back to President Trump's first term, hourly workers did better than supervisory workers. The bottom 50% of households had their net worth increase faster than the top 10%. And as I said, I believe that the households that you're describing there will be receiving substantial tax refunds. And again, as you said, many people have said to me, "Oh, so what's $1,000?" That, as you said, to these households, $1,000 is a substantial fill-up. They can put it toward savings, or they could pay it on debt. As I said, the Biden administration torched the financial standing of these households. The average CPI PCE increase was 22 or 23%. But for these households, which had a different bundle of goods and services than the indices, their costs, whether it was groceries, autos, rent, went up between 35 and 37%, and we are working every day to get those costs down.
Yeah, so it has such a cultural impact that even representatives of the United States are forced to respond to it. Emma, your thoughts on, this kind of the way that it's picking up in the US?
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny seeing, like Besant and also these other outlets like Economist and New York Times just trying to sort of scramble and find some way to justify the U.S. fall in living conditions. Because it's undeniable now that like Chinese people are enjoying, the fruits of like investment in national industries, public transit, all of these like benefits that clearly Americans are really yearning for and noticing like this huge disparity in what we're able to access. I think that we're kind of seeing like despite that, $1.6 billion allocated to counter the PRC's malign influence, we're seeing that it's kind of impossible to contain, right? I think Americans are realizing that there are other options. Like we don't have to live like this. There's another economic and governance model that works better than our own. Like another world is possible. And I think no matter how our media institutions try to spin it, there's just no way to deny that. This is the result of the U.S. neglecting our own infrastructure development, spending all of our money into like building more prisons, hiring more police, sending more weapons and funding to Israel. And this is how we can live if we actually invest in like the well-being and dignity of workers and everyday people instead of funneling it all towards these billionaires. And it's just, I think it's becoming more and more obvious to the American people now, and it's really threatening. I think the American ruling class that USA isn't number one anymore, and I think that was such an important part of Western propaganda that no one could ever be superior to us or enjoy a higher standard of living. But now we're seeing that that is possible.
Mm. Charles, any response to what Emma said or what Scott Bessent said?
Yeah, I mean, definitely echo everything that Emma said. And with regards to the Scott Bessent clip that you played, when he sent that to me, actually, it was the first time I'd heard Scott Bessent speak. And the guy is like really just uncharismatic beyond belief, right? I'm glad even legacy media are out there reporting when he, drops howlers like about how the U.S. intentionally destroyed Iran's economy and so on. Because God knows I would not have the patience to like listen through hours of testimony to find that out on my own. Anyway, there are a couple of interesting things about his specific response. One was that he immediately sort of pivoted to campaign mode with this like confused partisan attack on Biden. And defense of specific granular Trump policies, minus all of Trump's charisma, right? When the questioner, from China Media Group made very clear that the kill line, as the Qiao article mentioned, is a structural contradiction and a systemic disconnect in U.S. society, right? So it's there irrespective of which capitalist party is in power. And in fact, if you read the full Qiao piece, which is not that long, it actually diagnoses Trumpism itself as a symptom, like a morbid symptom of this precarity. It says, quote, "The MAGA movement systemically guides and reconstructs public demands in the economic and livelihood spheres into group confrontations in the realm of cultural identity." And then it lists some specific examples of this, like its xenophobia, its positioning of China as supposedly like an underhanded global rival, et cetera, right? And so I thought that was interesting, right? It speaks to sort of the longer term structural analysis that the CPC, and Chinese society at large are making versus the sort of hyper fixation, even in a forum like Davos, on basically partisan talking points coming from officials like Bessent. And the fact that at the end he expressed a bit of befuddlement and lack of familiarity with the kill line as a phenomenon is not super surprising, right? It did originate on Chinese social media, in gaming culture and so on. I wouldn't necessarily expect him to be fully up to date on that, but him being put in that position, I think, was an interesting inversion of the way that like journalists from the imperial core will typically expect their foreign interlocutors to be intimately familiar with like, all these details of Western hegemonic culture, without batting an eye. And the fact that you do have that kind of inversion now speaks, I think, at like a discursive and an ideological level to this new world, right? That we're entering, and of which this entire China maxing phenomenon is symptomatic, right? Where in fact, like cultural production, coming organically, coming from social media, from China, is going to have more and more of a worldwide impact as a function of the degree of like economic power that it has attained, not through colonialism, not through imperialism, but through its own sovereign development under the leadership of the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great point to leave it at. Emma and Charles, if people are interested in checking out Qiao Collective, maybe you could let them know where they can check out more of your work. Emma, you can begin.
Yeah, you can find our website at qiaocollective.com. There's lots of articles, translations, resource guides, and our handle is at Qiao Collective on Twitter and Instagram. And give us a follow.
Yeah, absolutely. Charles?
Yeah, I just wanted to plug some of our like recent publications. The most recent one was a contributed piece from two Chinese Canadians about, specifically the long history of xenophobia in Canada. Topical to have that reminder today, amid all the recent developments involving, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his visit to Beijing and his like apparent embrace of or rejection of a rules-based international order, right? We're also, now part of a larger collective called Sovereign Media, which I'm also part of as a journalist, and so it's a broader coalition that we're now part of with orgs like Venezuela Analysis, Orinoco Tribune, Kosachin News, Black Agenda Report, all kind of like sharing and helping to boost each other's content, because we recognize that where we're at today, China is not necessarily as much in the crosshairs of, either the sort of like imperial military machine or its propaganda apparatus, perhaps as it was like 5 or 6 years ago, right? But there are direct targets now that require our full-blown solidarity, particularly Venezuela after the recent military assaults, the kidnapping of its president and first lady, and Cuba today as it strains against this absolutely horrific fuel blockade. So we're really happy to be part of that larger coalition as well, and definitely urge people to give both us a follow at Qiao Collective, that's spelled QIAO, and Sovereign Media as well.
All right, yeah, everyone give them a follow. Emma and Charles, thank you so much for joining the China Report this week. Well, Chinese New Year is coming February 17th, and with it, lion dances. Ever wonder how performers master such impressive acrobatics and coordination? This viral Douyin video from a Shanxi training base shows you what goes on underneath the costume. A 19-year-old sister and her 10-year-old brother make every move look effortless. That's our show this week. Like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.